Welcome to Dallas TRHT's Transformation Tuesday. My name is Jerry Hawkins. I'm the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. Our mission is to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through narrative change, through relationship building, and through equitable policies and practices. Here today to welcome you all to Transformation Tuesdays, which is our effort to talk to our community with community members about how race and racism affects our communities and what we can do to address it. I'm here to introduce my friend, my buddy, my pal, Eva Arreguin, who is also a Dallas TRHT Steering Committee member. Eva is a proud Grand Prairie native, but also hailing from Oak Cliff, proud daughter of Mexican immigrants. In 2016, she graduated from UNT with a degree in media arts. She's also one of the founders of De Colores in Oak Cliff Arts Group, focused on lifting up and uniting marginalized communities. They also have a great podcast, which is voted, I think, the best podcast in the city, De Colores Radio. And she also works with Big Thought. Eva does a lot of great things in the city. Really proud to have her facilitate this conversation, and she will be introducing our panelists. I thank you all for being here with us today. Looking forward to hearing all of the amazing things that you all say, because these other people are also my friends as well. So thank you all for being here, and Eva, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to our conversation. I'm very honored and excited to be with you all. I am lucky to call these people friends as well. So I am going to briefly introduce each one of you. And if you can kind of share a little bit more about everything you do, because I know these bios do not grasp enough of the depth of your characters. So if you can tell me a little bit about yourself, and then we'll jump into the questions after that. So I want to introduce Florencia Velasco Fortner, Clyde Valentin, and Maria Yolisma Garcia. So thank you all for being with us. And if Florencia, if you can tell us a little bit more about yourself, please.
Thank you, Eva. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So I am the president and organization that has been working in Dallas and in the North Texas region for almost 40 years. I am an immigrant. I was born in Mexico. I immigrated here to the United States when I was 6 years old. I was undocumented until I was 18. I became a US citizen at 27. So for me, it's just a very raw conversation because, you know, not just because of my own background, but because of the families that we work with at the Concilio.
Thank you so much for sharing. Clyde, if you can go next, please.
Sure. So my name is Clyde Valentin. I'm the inaugural director of Ignite Arts Dallas at SMU's Meadow School of the Arts. Our mission at Ignite is to serve at the nexus of art, creativity, and engagement to foster and ignite the imagination of our students and citizens to envision more just and vibrant communities through artistic experiences. Prior to coming to Dallas, I'm a born and raised native New Yorker from Brooklyn. My parents were both born in Puerto Rico, but came here at very young ages. I think my dad was still a baby and my mom was maybe 5 years old. So they really grew up in Brooklyn. And, you know, given the citizenship status of Puerto Ricans, it's tough to say that we were immigrants, although there was a definitive immigrant experience, you know, based upon language barriers and politically at the time, in the 1950s, sort of the nationalist movement in Puerto Rico juxtaposed against, you know, the arrival and influx of Puerto Ricans into New York City, specifically as sort of a large migration wave. So that's sort of the backdrop of my family history. And when I was growing up, I grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, formative years were in the 90s, in New York City. And the backdrop for me was first one of sort of a bleak ghetto environment. I have a friend, Carlos Mayer, 139 Rodriguez, who likes to say that there aren't any more ghettos left in New York City, because, I distinctly remember growing up in the 70s and playing in burnt out buildings and running through rubble. You're lucky if you could find an empty lot, in New York City at this point to build on. So I was sort of the background, and culturally, part of what shaped me in those early years in the 80s and into the 90s was hip hop culture, right? So I kind of had this introduction to African American culture and Black culture primarily through hip hop, which has informed and shaped my worldview and perspective.
Beautiful. I'm definitely going to want to dive into that a little bit more when we can. Maria, can you go ahead and tell us a little more about yourself, please?
Cool, yeah. My name is Maria Yolisma Garcia. I always joke about my name because there's so many Maria Garcias, but seldomly do you find a Yolisma here in Dallas. I've been working in kind of what brings us all together here in this chat, and that's the immigration space. I've been doing that work since I was fresh out of high school. I, dubbed myself a little youth organizer, if you will. And so I learned from a lot of folks here in Dallas, some in this chat even. It's been an ongoing journey. What can I say? There's always new things to learn, new people to meet, and new different things to always dive into. So I've been with the North Texas Dream Team since 2013. And in that time, we helped pass a DACA, right, which is an executive order. And that was one with youth, just organizing in general, like really going up to bat for what was now, what is now DACA, even going into, formal immigration reform bills. And then you have deferred action for parents, which was dubbed DAPA. So there was a lot going on. And I do this work because myself, right, in my background, I immigrated to the States. I was 3 months old. I always tell people I didn't do all the heavy work. It was my mom. And so a lot of what I had, my experience growing up was, hey, I wasn't an immigrant, right? Because I can't imagine what it's like to be an immigrant mother, to have to raise a young child in a new country that she doesn't even know. So a lot of it is like, from my personal experience, I know just the difficulty it is to navigate it when one, like a new country, but two, all this legal jargon that gets thrown a lot. In our community, it's just like, tengo que arreglar mis papeles, but what does that look like? What does to arreglar los papeles look like? And we've been doing this type of work for free at no cost to our community in ways that are attainable to them. We think about COVID and how all of a sudden we assumed everyone's a digital native when that's not the case. So it's just like, we bring a lot of our workshops to our community, to their backyards for free. What used to be in person, and we have helped over thousands of individuals. We have people that come back to us because, DACA is a 2-year program. And we just love to see our people just continue to come to this organization. And we've built such strong connections, and to see people's dreams come true, I think for me is one of the reasons why I've stayed in this work so long, and why I continue to attest to that promise to myself, to be that person that I needed when I was younger. Even with this work, and even with work outside of immigration, I think it's important to bring a little bit of that into it. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm excited to dive into these questions and conversations with these wonderful folks.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you all for sharing a little bit more about yourselves. I still don't think any of you gave yourselves enough credit, but hopefully by the end of this program, all of you will learn more about what we're all up to, right? Because there's so much that can't even be, I guess, shared, because you're just so accustomed to it being a norm. And so I want to share with everyone watching that we will dive into these questions and then have a sort of Q&A towards the end as well. So I want to invite you all to share your questions and comments, of course, on our feed, and keep the questions more so towards the end so we can make sure to get to all of them, and we'll leave enough time to do that. So we'll jump into the questions now, and then of course, wherever the conversation leads us, I believe there is, I have such a mixed feeling right now towards a lot of these things regarding what a lot of people call Latinidad, because there's so much nuance that doesn't get addressed. And now more than ever, I believe these conversations are necessary, right? We have to address different things. And so I really hope we can kind of get to some of those in all of these. But we can start by asking you all, what can you share about the Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, and that's a conversation in itself, right? These labels, these titles that we keep getting kind of umbrellaed under. And like Clyde said, there's a different experience from being Puerto Rican in New York than being Mexican in Texas, right? So we have all this nuance. But what can you share about how the Latino community, excuse me, has responded in the past to racism in Dallas, right? And how is your community responding? Is there any history you'd like to share? And whoever feels comfortable starting, go for it. If not, I'll pick on someone. Okay, go ahead, Clyde.
So because my history is probably the youngest, I'll be the briefest, right, in terms of my experience here in Dallas in particular, right? And I think you know, coming from the Northeast and sort of having been educated by some of my Chicano brothers and sisters, mostly from California, yeah, I always knew sort of like Texas and the Southwest was even geographically a different place than like Aztlan, you know, in terms of just, you know, how the Chicanos hold it down in Cali, right? So understanding place, I think, is incredibly important. And you know, I know Jerry's not on the call at this point, but you know, from a historical perspective, you know, he's probably one of the most informed folks that I've met here in Dallas, who's also a transplant, you know, in terms of being incredibly voracious about, you know, knowing and sharing Dallas's history. I did a little bit of that work myself coming here. And I think the first sort of profound story that was shared with me early on, we were working on a project, I want to say it was part of Dallas Faces Race, the conference that came here in 2014. That may have been one of the first things I was involved in on the Arts and Culture Committee. I think it was, may have been Jeff Hurst from Teatro Dallas, who shared with me or maybe John Fullenwider, but the history of Santos Rodriguez and what happened around his life, you know, and his death. Teatro Dallas had written a play about it, so we ended up including it into a series of plays around police violence in 2014, short plays. So we worked with Teatro to kind of identify an appropriate excerpt. But that was one of the first times I had learned about a history of solidarity between the Latino, Latinx community here in Dallas and the African American community, you know, given sort of the egregiousness of that particular moment and story. I could be wrong about, you know, and I'm curious to know what Florencia and maybe what Maria Yolisma brings to the table about this, but it felt like a moment that was unique in the level of sort of community solidarity around what happened there. We're experiencing that right now. We experienced it through the summer. I don't know how common that is in Dallas, quite frankly, you know, because the other thing I've experienced is sort of the overt invisibility of the Latino community here, despite the demographics. And I'm just being honest, you know,
Right.
You don't feel us, you know, in the same way, despite the numbers, right, and the presence that we have and I'm saying we in the biggest, broadest umbrella context.
No, I absolutely agree. You brought up a lot of really great points. One of place uh, is a huge understanding, right? Because whenever I know when I think of my college experience, I never used the terminology Chicano. I did not want to be Chicano. My family obviously told me like that's for these American people. That's not for you. And it wasn't until I was taking, Chicano courses in college that I learned the actual definition of what it meant to be Chicano, which was like more of a political focused Mexican, right? You wanted to politically advance our people. And I was like, well, I want to do that. So then I went under this whole, like, I'm Chicana now, right? And so it's always been these identity issues. And I often joke about that on the podcast because it obviously ranges if you're Afro-Latina, if you're more white passing, or, white Latino, because even the terminology white passing is getting a lot of criticism right now. And so there's just all these layers that we don't often discuss. But being in California is a completely different narrative than being in Texas, than being in New York, right? And so I often say, like, when is Texas going to get its stories? We love Selena, but we are a lot more than that, right? And that identity is completely different wherever you go. And even in Texas, there's different identities within the major cities, right? So I definitely appreciate that point. And then I'm with you, right? I think it was once I returned and I started working in Oak Cliff more that I really learned the story of Santos Rodriguez. And even when we had Jerry on my podcast, and we discussed how that was one of the biggest moments of Black and Latino solidarity, right? And we need to see a lot more of it because there's so much that we have intertwined, but because our culture does not often discuss the anti-Blackness we have within it, it becomes so messy so quickly. So I definitely want to dissect that a little bit more if we have time later on, but I want to hear from our other panelists.
Clyde, you stole my thunder. I am from I immigrated from Mexico into California. My parents were farm workers in the Central Valley. Then we moved into LA County, which is where I went to most of my elementary, middle, and high school, and then went to college in Orange County. And as a young immigrant, there was a lot of shame about speaking Spanish. If it was almost like a hierarchy. If you were a Latino and didn't know Spanish, that meant that you were at a higher level because your parents spoke English. And if you were bilingual, then there's a shame to that. So I remember pretending sometimes that I didn't speak Spanish. And I remember I was like 14 and I was in line and I had my buddies with me, and I thought I was cool, and I remember this woman was struggling in Spanish and all my friends were there. And I think to me that was a turning point for me because I just decided to help her. So I went up and started to translate to her. And my friends were like, wait, I thought you didn't speak Spanish. And so, and then I had to answer all these questions. But I think, I remember being put on the red square during recess because I spoke Spanish. And I didn't speak English, so what was I supposed to speak? So all of that. And then when I went to college, I learned all about colonization and all about my people, not just here in the States, but what happened to Mexico and all the atrocities that were committed, and in some cases still are, to indigenous populations. And so then for about 10 years, I was a Chicana sister in the struggle. I used to call myself that. And but I think so I can't really contribute. So I'm hoping Maria can contribute to that conversation about Santos that you mentioned. But within the Hispanic Latino community, there exists a lot of discrimination based on country of origin, based on racism, based on color, and how you can trace your family lineage. And we bring that here. And so there's, I remember having a conversation with my friend. She was shocked that all the ugliness that happened to Yalitza Aparicio. I don't know if you she was
Of course,
not,
from Roma.
yeah, from Roma. She was nominated for Best Actress, and she's indigenous, first indigenous person to be nominated. And there was a lot of ugliness in Mexico about how unattractive and how it was just an atrocity for Mexicans to put that person up there, representative of Mexicans. And some of them were actresses and people in positions of power. And so, I remember telling my friend, I'm not shocked. I mean, I've been experiencing it, all my life, personally and professionally. And so I think we when we bring that here, then if you are poor, if you are indigenous, if you immigrated to this country with low levels of education, the integration into this country is even more difficult because you have that baggage from your country of origin piled on to the racism that exists here. I think there are some countries in Latin America that immigrate, or even Spain, Spaniards that immigrate to America, and they're able to integrate a lot quicker. And so there's a lot there that, again, Eva, if we started to dig into that conversation, we would spend a couple hours. But I think yeah, but I think for these purposes, I think we really have struggled as a community to really understand our identity, be proud of our identity, and pass that on to our children, so that we're not assimilating, but we are integrating in a way where we keep the greatness and the beauty of our ancestors, and and have this have a better life here.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing all that. You brought up so many great points that I'm like, okay, hopefully I don't know if we'll be able to dig in too much. But the first one I really considered was the concept of language, right? Because to so many people, and I think I saw some statistics somewhere that was like, if you don't speak Spanish, people don't consider you Latino, right? Or like, I know within my family, my Spanish is kind of choppy, so I get made fun of, and I'm like, I don't want to talk anymore, right? But it's like, if you don't speak in Spanish, you're not Latino enough. But if you, and to hear your history is very fascinating, right? Because I have heard that when especially if you spoke it here in the States, like, you're going to be punished because you're not supposed to. And that's not what we do here. And you have to assimilate. And then a lot of what I've seen happen with a lot of undocumented folks is chasing after the American dream, right? I know my family was going for that and still is to a lot of different degrees. And it's like, is that beneficial to us? Is that harmful to us? What does it mean to really dissect the American dream and see if it's even a real concept, right? Is it attainable? And then in addition is this concept of being indigenous, right? So it's like, I see a lot of people that run with this like, oh, we're all Mayan and Aztec. And I'm like, but we don't know that, right? Like, we know that we have brown complexions and definitely probably have some form of indigenous roots, but are we supposed to run with this concept that we didn't necessarily culturally grow up with, right? A lot of the Mexican identity is very, very nationalistic, right? And I often even criticize someone like Frida Kahlo, who has become like the face of what a Mexican woman might be, when in reality she was part German, right? And she took that identity and ran with it from indigenous people, but she was not, right? And so who are we allowing to get away with these things and kind of almost cosplay as these identities, right? And it gets really dangerous, because then when we have someone like Yalitza, it becomes heartbreaking to see how cruel the country still is to her, right? Even if she's on the cover of Vogue. And why did it take this major entity like the Oscars to be, finally validating her? And is she going to get more roles now, right? I see her doing a head and shoulders advertisement, and I'm excited to see she's still doing something. But I'm like, she was brilliant in that movie, right? She should be having more roles. And how are we building those things up instead of just letting that moment happen and letting it pass, right? And that happens a lot. And so it's a very strange thing to see a country like Mexico, I will say from my experience, right, like celebrate figures like her and Frida, and at the same time we know that they're still mocking them, right, and making fun of them on a lot of their programming and stuff. So I think not facing and being honest about our history and our truth makes it so much more complicated when you come to the country like the United States, and then you're trying to say, where do I fit in? Because I'm going to get treated based on complexion, based on class, based on, you know, education, all these different factors that we're not necessarily always considering when we arrive. So Maria, you ready to jump in? I know you have Dallas history.
I was jotting a lot of this down. I think everybody's hitting like really, really good points to Florencia's point. You know, in terms of folks from different countries that can immigrate here and assimilate, no problem. I think to my naturalization ceremony and the fact that there's so many diverse people from so many different countries. And at a moment I thought to myself, each one of these folks lived a much different experience than I did. And interestingly enough, when I was undocumented, nobody would believe me. And it wasn't until I was like much older in age that I realized, I don't think that people thought I was like the stereotypical Mexican that they had in their mind who was an undocumented immigrant. So then I set myself on this like personal quest to debunk this myth of what the undocumented immigrant is. And I was like, it's me. It's a person in your seventh period. It's somebody who, you know, is cracking jokes with you all the time. It's not somebody who you would regularly think. And this was also my first time in terms of coming into a cultural melting pot like my high school Woodrow Wilson, where that was the first time that I had classes with a lot of white folks. This is Old East Dallas meets Lakewood meets a piece of Pleasant Grove, and it was a really interesting mix. So I was always just really surprised at what conversations people would make. But all of that to say, I think with the proximity to whiteness, it allowed for a much easier process into assimilating into this country than it would have for somebody who wasn't. And I recognize that, right? I recognize that sometimes I do carry some of that white privilege in terms of, you know, I'm not automatically an immigrant when people see me, but yet I still stand strong in that identity. And to that point, I also wanted to go that I also recognize that not everybody in Dallas who is Latino is an immigrant, right? My first time diving into these big spaces and organizing, everybody was like, are you registered to vote? Are you registered to vote? You need to register to vote. And I was like, calm down. I'm not even a citizen. And now we're like, oh, okay. And
right.
These are a lot of second generation Tejanos who are like in this work because they're civically engaged. And a lot of them do remember Santos Rodriguez's riot. I say that because a lot of folks I had seen earlier were trying to undermine what all of it was, in terms of drawing a parallel to the protests that we were seeing not too long ago. But in 1973, right, this was a very important landscape in Dallas. Let me, you know, picture, this is the first time that a lot of schools are integrating. This is a time where a lot of Latinos are coming into more prominent spaces, into city workers or into, you know, they know the language. They're far removed from that immigrant identity, right? Because they're now working class citizens of the city of Dallas. And all in Little Mexico, right? So you have a little Maple area, what is now where people have brunch in Uptown, I like to dub, but was Little Mexico, and that alone carries so much history. You have what was a very prominent Catholic school, now is like a spaghetti pasta place. I don't know, no shade to that place. But St. Anne's, I think, was there, right? And that was the starting for a lot of folks. And so Little Mexico in itself was thriving, right? Pike Park, as we know it still stands, but it was thriving. It was a thriving community. And so when Santos happened, it was like a shock, right? Because Latinos are very much keep your head down, do your work, we'll be fine. But when it happened to one of their own, it shook the city to its core. But you also have a community that has been fighting police brutality since the inception of the police department. And that was our Black brothers and sisters. So when it happened to us, who did we automatically look to for support? It was the Black community that came out and rallied with us down the streets of Dallas. And because of it, it was the big pivotal moment for Latinos to realize this can happen to us too. How do we take back our power? And that's all of the sudden, right? You start seeing a lot more vocalization. But you had Anita Martinez at the time, the first Mexican-American city councilwoman in the city of Dallas. Everyone's looking to her now, right? Because it's like, now we need a demand from the city. We need more, we need more. And the power dynamic for Latinos then was like civic engagement. And it has to continue, right? Because that was the only way at the time that we saw our voice was going to be heard. And from then on, you saw a lot of milestones for Latinos. You know, the first Latina to graduate from law school at SMU, Adelfa Callejo, you know, may God rest her soul. She in itself is a powerhouse in Dallas and is a very widely recognized name for Latinas in law. And so Adelfa Callejo kind of led a lot of civil rights pieces and then many others that came after her. But I think back to had Santos, you know, Santos's life was taken at the hands of Officer Kane, you know, in the back of his police car, point blank, Russian roulette style. And that's when it took Latinos to really rise up to the occasion, right? Because it was us just keeping our heads down, doing our civic duty, but it's like there was more and we always have to demand more. And I think as Latinos, we've just grown so accustomed to getting comfortable and complacent and that's it, right? And so I also think to Dallas now, why isn't it that we have risen to the occasion, which is with as much tenacity that we need to for Black and Brown unity, right? We need to. It's not a we can stand back here and wait until it happens to one of our own type of situation. This struggle has been, you know, there's this, I go back to this quote, it's like, our liberation is tied with each other's, right? There's no liberation for some, there's liberation for all. And so I think to this moment that we're in right now of civil unrest, of you know, going to the city and demanding for funding for all of us, it affects everybody. Just a Latino issue, or it's just a Black issue. It's an everyone issue in the city of Dallas, with recognizing that Black lives are at the forefront, right? And so that's kind of how the history has played into today, right? Yes, Latinos are still all about civic engagement, and because of what happened in 1973, I feel like those folks from that generation still want to do things with civility, and then you have this younger generation who's like, nah, fam, we're about to take everything and we're about to we need to start from a blank slate, which to that point, right, we kind of need to. And it's a lot of, you know, because we come from families of immigrants, a lot of this younger generation that's in the streets, right? These are immigrants who don't know what happened, but second, third generation Tejanos, they're very much like, there's different ways, like we can calm down everybody, like we just have to vote somebody into office and we'll be fine. But at some point it isn't, right? We've done that, we've seen it, and it hasn't happened. And that's kind of what happened with Santos' story too, right? We started electing people into office, change still wasn't happening. And it's an ongoing cycle that we've kind of seen since the 70s into now, the late 2000s into 2020s. So that was a little history bit. I know I'm pretty long-winded, but I'll pass it.
No, you're great. Not at all. You opened a lot of different jars that I definitely was waiting for. And there's just so much there, right? And so Santos Rodriguez being one of the biggest historical moments for our people is definitely necessary. And I'd be remiss if I didn't, for one, name Michael Moorhead, right? Who was a young Black man that was also murdered by, or by Daryl Kane, right? And so that's what even united us even more in that moment, right? Is that this police officer had already been involved in a shooting of a Black man, right? So then when it happened to a young Latino man or a young boy, right? He was a child. It brought us together, and I hate that it takes these moments of severe trauma for us to recognize that we deserve rights, right? It shouldn't take that. It shouldn't take this continued cycle of oppression for us to say, hey, we deserve to be recognized and to be celebrated, right? So I definitely wanted to mention that, as well as the complacency bit that you kind of mentioned. There's so much of that, right? I think with Santos, I found it very fascinating because my family initially immigrated to Oak Cliff, right? And so I feel like I'm still learning history about my family. Even the other day, my sister showed my father some photos of his old soccer games, and he was like, oh yeah, Anita Martinez sponsored those. And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, she sponsored the jerseys. And they were some of the big first Mexican soccer stars here, right? Like they had their teams in each community, and it was a big deal. But I'm still learning that, like, my family initially immigrated to Oak Cliff. My tia had a botanica on Jefferson. I was like, what? I never knew this, right? And so, like, there's a reason why we don't know this history. Even our own might take some unpacking to do, right? I also learned my dad, like, helped run a tiendita right there where Spiral Diner is now, right? And then someone like me can't afford to live there anymore because it's so gentrified. And so really understanding the depths of who built this city, and that it is first and foremost on stolen land and built from stolen labor. And then in addition, who helped build the railroads, who did all the infrastructure here, and who is getting credit for it, who is still getting paid for these buildings. And so there's so much there, right? And understanding that this complacency component, so that we might just see something closer to the American dream by being quiet, I don't think is working, right? It is respectable, it is commendable. But I'm definitely a part of that generation Maria is talking about, where I'm like, okay, what does it look like to really rebuild this thing, right? And to be honest about our complacency and our history in order to really form what we want to see our kids thrive in, right? We don't want to keep this same model of confused identities and you know, we only get celebrated around Cinco de Mayo or, you know, September 16th or whatever, whenever Hispanic Heritage Month begins, right? Like, what does all that mean to really take that history and run with it and then form something even stronger and better, and really in celebration of who we are as individuals, right? Because there are so many of these complexities. Does anybody want to add anything more before we move on to the next question? All right. Go ahead.
If I may, you know, listening to you and Maria Yolisma build on sort of the generational differences and the very necessary lack of patience around particular protocols and, you know, ways of being, reminds me of what I learned from my mentors, many of them who were young lords, which was the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers in New York City. So generationally even, right, there's like, you know, I learned from elders who in some ways parallel your stories in terms of coming to the United States, growing up a particular sort of way, beginning to, you know, receiving an education, and then developing and being inspired by the Black Panthers to develop a platform, you know, around the Puerto Rican community in Chicago, East Harlem, Boston, Philadelphia, and learning from that, right? So there's a hope that springs from me there in terms of just the knowing the importance of being able to lead and follow young people specifically, and what they bring to the table, and the sorts of exchange. They didn't have that exchange with their parents, right? Because their parents were, keep your head down, work hard, Mija, what are you doing? Like, this is crazy, I don't even understand it. To my generation, right? We were able to kind of take that and kind of keep moving in a place like New York. So, you know, that's our future, right? And I just needed to interject with that little piece.
For sure. Thank you, Clyde. Florencia, go ahead.
Yes, hi. You know, I wanted to add one other dimension to Latinos here in Dallas. Growing up in California, we had a diversity of, Latin American countries. So I remember, hanging out with Colombians, Puerto Ricans, people from Cuba, all over, and coming to Dallas and really being surprised. I mean, I used to dance salsa. The first thing I did was think, where are the salsa clubs? And here in Dallas, and we did have a few, but and there was a small number of other Latin American countries, but for the most part, the diversity was between Mexicans that had been here for generations, since Texas was Mexico. 7 generations, and then the new immigrants. And so we Dallas hasn't had an opportunity, hasn't had the decades or the centuries that cities like Miami, New York, Los Angeles, El Paso have had to deal with this population. Our Latino population grew significantly from like 10% in the early 1980s to over 40, about 40% right now, and the majority of them are the families that the Concilio works with, which are immigrants. They immigrate from Latin American countries, have low levels of education, and therefore are uncomfortable engaging. So in a way, we may see it as complacency, or they just don't care, or whatever. I mean, I hear that all the time when we go into schools. These parents just don't care. Of course they care. They love their children just like you love your children. But they're hesitant to engage in schools and in all aspects of their life, including the political arena, because they may be undocumented, or they may have somebody in their family that's undocumented, and and add on a bunch of other issues.
I agree 100%. I think, and with that complacency, it's definitely not supposed to be like a demeaning connotation, right? It's just like, it is because of this fear and wanting to understand. And that's where now I think of organizations like the Dallas Mexican American Historical League, DMO, that is working on, keeping a lot of this history alive and archiving it, right? Because something I didn't mention earlier, but is like, I remember, because my mom came later in the 70s, and then that's kind of when that big influx of a lot of new immigrants came from Mexico. And so I often consider that she mentioned, oh yeah, I remember my dad talking about, my grandpa talking about this corrido about Santos. And that's how she learned about it, right? She's like, oh yeah, they sang about it and brought it to Mexico. And I was like, whoa, right? Like, I had never heard her talk about it, but that is how I learned the history later on, when I asked her, like, hey, did you know about this? It was right before you came, right? And so I think that's very fascinating, because there's a reason why a lot of this history is kept from us, right? And I think really learning this history is what empowers us. And that's where the complacency comes from, right? Is that we want to be empowered. We want to understand that we have power and that we have the right to know this thing, to know our culture, and to move culture forward, right? And so I definitely want us all to consider, like, there's a reason why this history has been kept from us. And I've been very excited to see that even like the district is now incorporating Mexican American studies, right? And so I definitely want to expand that beyond just the Mexican hegemony, right? Because that also becomes very dangerous to only focus, especially in a place like Texas. It is very Mexican centric, as opposed to somewhere like LA or Miami or New York. And so I often have to say, okay, pass the mic, right? This isn't all about Viva Mexico, right? Let's talk about what's happening in these other countries, right? And especially right now at the border, there's a lot of this like Mexican narrative, when a lot of those are not Mexican people, right? There's a lot of Haitian people as well. And there's a lot of issues within that, with it ignoring the Black undocumented people, especially here in Dallas, where it's, we have some of the highest deportation rates. I'm not mistaken, we're number one, and that's another embarrassing statistic to me, right? Because we're also the majority, or we're going to be the majority if we're not already in this city, and understanding what power comes with that. And what will it take for us to get on the same page to really move ourselves and our people forward, right? And understanding the depths of that. And so when I think of that, I'm like, oh my gosh, right? 10 years ago, I couldn't buy elote on every corner, and now they're selling it for $10 at a restaurant sometimes, right? And you're like, what's happening? But it's happening in front of our eyes. And so really understanding the depths of that, I think, is critical in this time. So we're going to move to the next question, because that was only the first one. Why is this time with the pandemic, this reckoning of racism, the election, different for you and or your organization? And what are you planning to do? I think we've touched on this a little bit in different ways, but I know it's such an overwhelming time that we definitely want to hear more about what you all are doing right now. Go for it, Florencia. I feel you wanting to go.
Okay, I'll go, Eva. I think COVID has exposed the inequities that have existed for people of color. And when I mean people of color, I mean, of course, Latino and African American, in a way that can no longer be ignored. There are huge gaps between the haves and have-nots in education, health, technology, the workforce, the criminal justice system, and in other areas. So I think, that's one of the things that COVID has done. The second thing that it's done, in impacting us as an organization, is that parental engagement is front and center and has become critical to the education of our children. The Concilio has been championing parental engagement for almost 20 years. And now, I mean, we hear, and sometimes I look at Facebook and Instagram and hear, moms that have all the resources, that have a bachelor's or a master's degree, and how they are just, struggling with virtual education with their children. Well, imagine our parents, they don't speak English. They may not have it. They more than likely don't have internet at their home, and they're having to educate their children. So we need to invest resources to help these families, because if the parents aren't equipped, if the parents aren't able to provide an environment that's conducive for learning, the education gap is going to get even bigger. And so then the third thing that this pandemic has done is that we cannot compartmentalize the life of families. Families that are struggling need support in all aspects of their life. We can't just say, okay, let's do education program for the kids, and they better have, we better have strong outcomes, because how can young people and their parents say, let's focus on sending our kids to college, when they may not even have electricity? We had a call from a family just before school started, virtual school started. Their electricity had been turned off. And of course, they had a little, they were going to get a hotspot from the school district, but they had no electricity. How were the children supposed to go to school? They had been on beans and frijoles and tortillas for a couple of weeks now. So so then we had to come in and we provided them resources to help to cover their electric bill, and provided them with some basic needs and supplies. But we cannot compartmentalize. If we want families to succeed, we have to provide a holistic approach. They're environmental obstacles. They're living in food deserts, transportation issues, social emotional stress, financial anxiety. All of that is impacting them socially. It's impacting, there's research that's impacting their brains. I mean, we need to provide services and programs that are going to look at them as a whole family, and try to address and try to help them overcome all of these issues that are just compounding because of COVID. What the Concilio is doing is we are not just doing our regular institutes, every single family that we work with, and even if we don't work with them, if somebody calls us and asks us for support, we're going to provide wraparound services for everybody, so that at least during this COVID season, so that we can help them get through this. And then, nobody knows what's going to happen at the other end, but there's going to be some serious consequences and repercussions for people of color because of COVID. And then the other thing that we're doing that it's connected to the previous question is we're introducing into our curriculum social emotional support and information for families. And then the second one is one of our programs, we're introducing cultural competency. We have a course on identity, self-care, and we're weaving all of that together because we want the parents to be strengthened. It's sort of like the analogy of going in a plane and them telling you to put the mask on yourself first and then put it on someone else. We want to make sure that our parents are strong and capable and able to lead their children at home. And then as for the election, vote, 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 vota. I mean, come on. I mean, we historically don't vote in the numbers that we should, that represent who we are in this country. And that's a big reason why we are not brought to the table. And sometimes, and many times, we are an afterthought when it comes to investing in our people.
Thank you, Florencia. I think there's a lot of great points to cover there. I agree. To me, there's no time like the current moment to recognize just the levels of how the oppression works, right? There's a reason why Black and Latino people have the highest COVID rates, right? It's the same reasons why systemically we have been the most, quote unquote, disenfranchised, right? All these terminologies that we get labeled, there's a reason why. Even with voting, right? If we're looking at what's happening right now, our governor is literally saying, actually, no, nix all that. We're going to make it one ballot or whatever it is. And I'm like, that's all intentional, right? So I personally do not like putting the blame on Black and Latino folks, on people of color, because we do get treated as an afterthought, and then they pander to us and we're supposed to just vote, and then it's our fault if we get a white supremacist in office, right? And I push back on that a little bit, because I understand the power in voting, and I understand that it takes much more than voting, right? We have to do much more than voting if we want to understand our power and to demand more of our city officials, right? Even thinking about this summer with, these defund the police and defund DPD, there was city council meeting after city council meeting, hundreds of people calling saying, hey, we want you to defund police, we want you to divest. And what did the city do? They ignored it, right? And then they made a big deal about a few million, right? And then we're like, but we don't know how we're supposed to help safety in South Oak Cliff. And it's like, but you're not investing in the communities. You're not providing the transportation. You're not providing good grocery stores. You're not providing any of these things. So how exactly is this supposed to happen, right? And then again, like I'm saying, whenever, we're not voting, then they're like, how come? And it's like, we're talking about how this history goes, how it's kept from us, how we've already been, kind of put down. And then it's supposed to be also our fault that we have this leader in charge. And I'm like, no, you can't keep kicking people while they're down and expect them to fix it. And so I definitely want to thank you for your work you're doing with the Concilio, because I think that parental engagement component, I work with schools, I work with students, and I get to see, I'm very grateful to have the trust of both parents and young people in understanding that, like, if you don't treat them and meet them where they are and treat them with respect and not like you're looking down on them, for starters, you're not gonna get anywhere, right? Understanding the humanity and beauty of each individual is key, it's critical, right? And going with that lens of like, yes, your social and emotional well-being is an absolute key in getting what you need, right? And understanding that you're trying your best and hopefully we can help you even more. So your work is really important. I think that is a component that gets overlooked and the blame just keeps getting thrown. And it's like, no, there's a lot of systemic factors that we're ignoring and we have to pay attention to as well. Did anybody else want to jump in on that question?
I really wanted to jump in and appreciate, Florencia for acknowledging the inequities that our city is seeing, right? When we work with a lot of immigrant families, it's really hard to kind of reach out, right? And in the time that we're in the landscape in terms of the heightened news cycle on police brutality, and our immigrant community is like, who do they call, right? Who are they to reach out to? And I think the work that the Concilio does is outstanding in terms of they're already within a space that is accessible to parents. For us, it's a little bit interesting, right? Because we don't have that accessibility to the schools, but rather more or less through our media partners and social media. And so it's been a challenge because, like I mentioned earlier, we just assumed everybody was a digital native and went all completely digital, when in fact a lot of folks still don't have access to Wi-Fi, or maybe the bandwidth is really short. So already, right, we're already seeing the inequities there with internet access. And so we did DACA workshops online, but doing a Zoom breakout is not for the lighthearted, right? You're like, where am I, or how, what is happening? So to navigate this with immigrant families in mind, we really had to think outside the box. And also I think to a recent deportation defense case that we took on is people are still getting deported even with COVID happening. And it's really unfortunate. And we've felt almost a sense of helplessness, because how do we go to our community in the best way that they know how in terms of giving them know your rights materials? So we've been kind of like on the back end fighting in terms of policy, like how do we get ICE out of our jails? How do we minimize the deportation pipeline, which the North Texas Immigration Coalition will be doing a webinar. Well, when this airs, right, it'll be Tuesday, but to kind of minimize that deportation pipeline, right? Because we want to ensure that our families can at least live in that security within Dallas city lines, and a larger North Texas is what we imagine. And yes, while civic engagement does play a part into it, we also live in a very voter suppressed state. I saw on Twitter not too long ago, it's like, we don't live in a red state, we live in a voter suppressed state. I myself included, I became a citizen in 2018, registered to vote, and I think that I have the worst luck. But tell me why then they start going back in the voter rolls and saying people voted unlawfully, which introduced the litigation against then Secretary of State David Whitley. And I played a role in terms of being a plaintiff in that case, to be like, how dare you, want to automatically assume that because there was an increase in Black and brown voters, that they were voting unlawfully. So you had the state of Texas just go running around trying to take people off the voter rolls and take away the one right that I fought so hard to earn. And I think, people who are natural born citizens, I would get so frustrated because that's a right you are born with. I had to pay thousands of dollars into this system and wait over 18 years to get that one opportunity to cast a ballot. And so while I do say go vote, I also, I say it entre comillas, we say it's like within that quotation mark, right? Because there's a lot of inequalities within the voting process already, right? The transportation to go somewhere to drop off your voter registration card. I think to our, folks with different abilities who probably, some of these spaces that aren't ADA compliant, even some of the polling locations, and the language barrier that may play for a lot of folks. It's so easy for us to say a certain action without realizing and recognizing that there's a lot of, roadblocks within that action. So for me, it's like, yes, please go vote, but also like, I like what you always say, Eva. It's like, yes, go vote, and, be involved civically and try to be that bridge for others. Which is why I became a VDR and was like, hey, if you can't get to it, let me go to you. And I will go to folks like wherever they need to be, because I understand the severity of just like how suppressed our votes can be in the state of Texas.
Right. Thank you, Maria. You covered a lot of great points. I really think a lot of these things we're dealing with, it feels very intentional, right? If we look differently or we were from a different class or a different community, we might not be facing these things in these ways, right? And so understanding that, as well as why don't people want to vote? Why are they uncomfortable with who's running? Do they look like us? Do they feel like us? Are they going to work for us? Are they going to, and so considering all those factors as well. Are they really going to stand up? Are they going to do anything for the LGBT community, right? Like there's so many different factors that we always have to consider outside of just whatever our personal norm is. Clyde, did you want to add anything?
I only want to amplify what's already been said by Florencia and Maria, and that is that the age of siloed approaches is over. We have to, and this is hard because we're building to the point about voting and civic engagement transcending election day, and it being a 24/7 activity is a muscle and a practice we have to build in ourselves and with each other in community, right? The ability to think complexly and understand, to Florencia's point, that these issues are holistic. They transcend and go across systems of mobility, education, access to healthy food, which is ultimately nutrition, which enables you to comprehend and focus, right? Like, these are systems, and that's just where we are right now. And I'll add this, and this comes from the work of some colleagues, Jeff Chang being one who wrote Who We Be, Fabiana Rodriguez from the Center for Cultural Power, who I know some of you know, and that is, the premise that culture is always at the forefront of social change, policy change, economic change. And to underscore our shift in culture, this moment right now, what we're experiencing, what we're going through, the why, is that, right? Is the response to an attempt to silo us, to create divisions, to isolate these issues, immigrants at the border, migrants at the border, police brutality, state violence, environmental justice. We know that these things overlap and affect us acutely as communities, and we're unpacking that. And I would say that the role that I think artists and culture bearers and creatives have in this work is to help amplify and illuminate and distill, right? So that the accessibility and the knowledge of these systems, the work that y'all were doing to educate folks, I'm specifically referring to Our City, Our Future, around the budget in Dallas, to break down the proposal of the $200 million and the reallocation into specific sectors. That's an example of this confluence of thinking complexly, right? And to educate as many people as possible around, new ideas and new thinking. And, that's not going to go away. I know that's not going to go away. And despite what happened, this particular budget cycle, there's an election next May. And I know no one's forgetting that, right? And we just need to continue to do that work and make sure that we're putting people on the ticket. And, that also happened the last election cycle. Some folks didn't win, right? Particular seats. That's going to be different, because the other dynamic, which has, I think, everything to do with culture, is that people continue to move here from other places, and they have different expectations around what they need to see from their city. And there are fundamental rights on a democratic, humanistic level that we simply do not provide the residents of our city. And I think, the veil is being lifted from that work.
I love it. Amplify, illuminate, and distill. I wrote it down and I put an exclamation point, Clyde, because I appreciate the work each of y'all are doing, right? You kind of all work in different sectors, but they all are so intertwined, right? And we're all affected by these things constantly. And so I appreciate you shouting out Our City, Our Future, my people over there, my crew I'm happy to work with and be a part of. That really was intentional about all of these issues, right? And saying, hey, reallocate this money to the people, That's what we want. We want this money invested into the communities so we can actually transform what our city looks like, right? Because I know we all see the potential. We know the beautiful people are here and ready to go, but what does it look like to actually fund these things and make them happen? So I'm with you, Clyde, that voting, and like all of you said, voting is just one component, right? It is not the whole thing. That's not where your activism ends. That's not where your good deed is over. That's just a part of what we can really do to transform. I know we're down to the last few minutes and I want to give us some Q&A time, so I'm going to kind of hopefully touch these last couple questions before we do some Q&A time. So who can describe the healing, transformation, and reparations that you believe need to happen in order to have an equitable Latino community? We've discussed it and touched base a little bit on it here. Does anybody want to add anything else? I know I'm a big sucker for healing, so I'm definitely curious as to what everyone else's responses are. That's my new title, Sucker for Healing.
You know, there's a lot of ways in that we can heal, but one of the things that I think is very important that I got from a Old Testament theologian. My husband's a pastor, so I'm a pastor's wife, and one of my favorite theologians is Walter Brueggemann. He talks about the importance of the public processing of private pain. And so I think that when it comes to racial healing, those that have been hurt, those that have been taken advantage of, we need to have room for those voices to become public and for them to have that opportunity. And I think those that whose ancestors or them themselves have done the hurting, to listen and take it in and understand. And I think you know, that piece of healing, I think, is very complex. So I just wanted to give that one. There's a lot more to it, but that's just something that sometimes gets overlooked. And then in terms of reparations has always left this unsettling, it's always been unsettling to me. Why? Because how do you put a price tag to the hurt, the pain, the injustice that you did to my ancestors, to my mother, to my great-grandmother, and so forth and so on? How do you put a price tag on the anger and the repression that I still feel? I think that the true cost is too high and they can't afford. And if it's too low, it's going to be insulting. So I think I would like to think about, how do we create a path forward? What are we going to do right now that's going to impact us right now and for the generation to come, so that these systems change?
Thank you. The public processing of private pain. I feel like right now there's a lot of private pain happening because we're all at home and we're alone and we're scared and we're mourning. And they're really, like, when I really sit and think about it, I cannot grasp the depths of everything that's happening right now. And to see, I saw a tweet. I spent a lot of time on Twitter as well. But it was someone mentioned the way Westerners mourn is so basically toxic, right? Just repressing it, pretending everything's fine, go back to work, let's continue the cycle of capitalism because that's how we have to survive. And what does that do for us, right? Like, how is that allowing us to heal and to process these things? And when I think of my culture, I think of, you know, we take a week to do rosaries, right? Or we physically mourn and grieve, and we haven't been able to do that in this time, right? And we haven't done it historically as a country. And so I'm with you. I often think about in these murders, like, what does justice really look like? Is justice putting someone else in a cage, right? Is that what will make it just then, when we have lost a human life that we can't regain? And so I'm with you. It's hard, but I definitely think reparations are necessary. And so really exploring what that looks like. And in a lot of ways, if we're saying, hey, let's funnel this money this direction, let's give it to the people, like, that's what I want to see happen, right? Clyde and Maria, do you have anything else to add?
Maria, I'm gonna defer to you. No. You know, I personally, I've certainly cried a lot over the last few months, and we knew going in that we were going to lose people to COVID, based upon, you know, our family in New York, and we did. You know, and I'm just privileged and blessed to have a partner to cry with, and not alone. You know, if I'm being 100, right? And I know not everybody has that. You know, and that was even before June, right? You know, I've lost friends that I couldn't publicly mourn with, to your point, Eva, in terms of folks out, you know, on the West Coast or the East Coast, during this period in time. One of the things that we're doing, you know, on the arts and culture front is working. We've been working for a few months now with pretty large cohort of folks from the criminal justice reform space, folks that are focused on environmental justice, to create a project called Healing Pieces that's gonna, you know, run for a couple of years here in Dallas, different sort of exhibitions, and impart our response. So we didn't quite jump in right away, for a lot of reasons, but we've been cultivating this sort of longer term vision where we'll continue to kind of, you know, cultivate and propel space, that is around healing. The first project is this piece called Black Power Naps, and it's just all about rest for people of color. So there's going to be hammocks and grass mounds and wind chimes and sound design in an open space, with distancing in mind, and we'll be reaching out to communities that we've been working with this cohort to come and enjoy the space and to promote just like sometimes doing nothing, right? Just to regenerate and to reconnect. But, you know, that in itself is a radical act sometimes because we're all compelled to do so much. And, you know, that's another issue I've kind of experienced to witness from my elders who got burnt out and, you know, dysfunctional or, you know, succumbed to addiction in one shape or form, carried that trauma to, you know, their children who are my peers. And then you see that manifest in different ways. And you know, so we also have to counter that. And that feels like a distinct cultural shift too. And we have to be out in front in terms of shaping our narratives, right? These new narratives that are emerging for ourselves and each other, because we see how easily that can be, we can get thrown off our work just based upon one particular wedge, right? And I'll just, I would say that, again, the narrative, part of the narrative space we need to cultivate is one that promotes health, healing, solidarity, and collectivism.
Beautiful, love it. I know there's an account called the Nap Ministry, which is led by a radical Black woman who is brilliant.
I follow. Yes.
Yes, I absolutely love that concept. Yeah, I think it's crucial because so much, and when I think about it, because I'm kind of the same way, I am very much my mother's daughter, and so much of the undocumented narrative and experience is centered around labor, right? All of what we need to focus on. I know my mom, sometimes she'll be like, oh, I'm so tired, but I need to da-da-da. And I'm like, why don't you just nap for 10 minutes? And it's like, I have to tell her like, hey, you can do that. And she's like, oh yeah, I can, right? But it's like, what about in the moments when I'm not around you, right? You're just driving yourself mad almost because you're trying to survive. And so it is radical to say, you know what? I'm gonna lay down and sleep. I'm gonna lay down and meditate. I wanna go cry. I'm gonna, you know, like all these things, though they might seem trivial to some, they are radical, right? When you're used and your genes are used to trauma and labor and working and this high intensity kind of lifestyle. And so I'm with you. I'm like, let's do this. Let's heal. Let's really take a moment to process, and not only to just do that, but also to find joy and live and thrive, right, as outside of just our trauma. Maria, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of good points were touched in terms of like really being vulnerable with those feelings as well, I think is also very important. Where we're hurting or where a community is hurting to move forward for that process, right? Because so often I think of, right, in terms of that process or that journey of healing to begin. So I think it's important, and for anyone who's watching, right, it's like we're always kind of like, well, what's wrong? What is happening? Maybe it's something that we haven't really touched on that we really need to heal from. And I'm guilty of that. In terms of like the broader question also is, for our community, right, the immigrant community, I think to how we did a disservice to other immigrant groups in North Texas. You know, we had this very like dreamer narrative being pushed in the 2010s that was very like model immigrant narrative, very Latino focused. Here in the South, very Mexican centric, right? And then fast forward a couple of years, our Black immigrant brothers and sisters in this movement have been disproportionately affected in terms of TPS being cut way too fast, in terms of permits that are capped at a certain number for Black immigrants in the United States. So it was very much like recognizing our fault in terms of, yes, we unfortunately led that narrative, but also acknowledging it and saying, moving forward, right, what are we going to do to involve them in these conversations, to what we've been doing in terms of the North Texas Dream Team to also do that. Because, you know, back to the original question in terms of Latinidad, right, there are Black Latinos that a lot of folks don't think about in the immigration spaces, myself included, right? We went so like, I went very naively into this work, and now like into adulthood, I've realized and I've seen things from a different lens of how do we, you know, pull in everybody from this diaspora of Latinidad. And that's just kind of a few things that I wanted to add to this.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Maria. We are asking for everyone's Q&As now. We're down to the last few minutes. I will touch on this last question, which I believe is kind of intertwined with a question we have here and have received. Racial equity, racial healing, and racial justice in Dallas. We've touched this a little bit. Another question we just received says, how can we, I think they work together, how can we as a Latino community do a better job at sharing our experiences with the rest of Dallas? How can we establish a safe space, welcoming non-Latinos to get to know us better, heck, to get to know each other better? That's fair. And yes, so we'll end that question there because there's a lot there, but I'm with you.
Stories, that's number one, right? How do we create space to tell the very diverse, rich, layered, complex stories, and not embrace the false sort of myth of the monolith, right? Because there is no monolith. Florencia talked about her experience growing up in California and then coming here and realizing, oh, the place is different, the demographics are different. All of us, whether we come from Spanish-speaking colonies to countries to North America, the Western Hemisphere is by definition, was colonized by either white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the Portuguese, or the Spanish, a little bit of Dutch in terms of the Western Hemisphere. All of them subscribed to this notion of white supremacy, to give them permission to suppress and subjugate African peoples, indigenous peoples, right? And that may sound didactic, but it's incredibly important to continuously deconstruct as we have contemporary conversations and not lose sight of that, you know? So it's even hard to, you know, what stories are we sharing that by definition make us Latinx or Latino, where it might be a New Yorican story, right? Or a Chicano story, or an Ecuadorian story, or right, a story from the South, right, the Deep South. So you know, it's we have to also be careful not to subscribe to the myth of the monolith in our communities.
Absolutely. If everybody's okay with going over time a little bit, I definitely want to explore more of these responses and questions we're getting in. Florencia, did you want to add anything, or Maria?
Did you have something to say, Maria? Do you want to go? No. Okay. Well, I think you know, we have to. I think Clyde mentioned about you know, getting to know one another. We have to build relationships and an understanding. First, I think with each other. The Latino Hispanic community is so complex. And, you know, I think I mentioned at the beginning that there's a hierarchy depending on what country of origin your family's from. So I think we have to get to know each other. And then also how we share our stories with African-American community, with the white community, to be able to not just be heard and share our stories and become human to one another, but also to you know, listen to their stories and have patience and suspend judgment on both sides. Because when I was younger, I had very little patience with microaggression, or with people that I knew had said something racist. I would not talk to them. I just, you know, I wouldn't really engage. And I think there's some people that just have some stereotypes and that have never really met a person of color, engage with a person of color. So, and I have seen in the you know, since I started to engage with others, that they have been transformed as well. And I think finding that and giving yourself permission, like Maria said, being vulnerable and being able to engage and build those relationships with people that are not like you, and having patience both ways, I think is an important step for building relationships and building allies across race, across countries, across ethnicity.
Yeah, and Florencia, you kind of boggled my brain here a little bit in terms of like the anti-racism work we should be doing as Latinos. You know, one, understanding that we are much more than what we see on a day-to-day in terms of what our Latino experience may be. It's about supporting this this movement for Black lives, and also dispelling this myth of this what's it called, this prejudice that we kind of come with within our families that sometimes carries anti-Blackness tonality. Some of these spaces, institutions that we've grown up with, it wasn't until, like, again, right later that I realized I wasn't really in fellowship with Black folks up until I was more in school. So in public school, and when I was out of ESL, that I started, you know, understanding who are my neighbors, who are my friends, who am I hanging out with, who am I learning from. I learned English, and I took a lot of English from, you know, not just public PBS, but also, you know, the introduction through a Black lens of kind of how I grew up with the pop culture scene. And all of this to say, right, I think by breaking down anti-Blackness, that is already doing some anti-racism work within our own spaces that we have access to. It's having conversation en español para nuestra gente to understand a little bit more of what that means, right? Because we are so used to seeing the a very like light-skinned person portrayed in telenovelas and in our media and everything else in between. So it's been, for myself, a very interesting journey, for me to talk to my parents about that, especially when there is so much happening, right? It's like, first, how do we break down what's happening in the news to a way that my parents can understand, to a way where then they can start doing some of that work as well. Because it doesn't just stop with me. It needs to continue as a chain reaction for anti-racism to really start taking fold into our communities. And I sneak it into our rosaries too, right? It'll be like, I want to pray for all of the work that is being done in the front lines to defend our Black brothers and sisters. And it needs to happen in these conversations and in these spaces for it to truly see light.
Absolutely. I definitely, I'm with you. I think there is so much to understand, right? My mom has shared with me, you know, being from Michoacan, she didn't see a lot of Black people in her area, right? It wasn't until she came to Texas that she said she saw her first Black person, right? And then I completely grew up with Black culture, right? It is a huge part of my influence, and that's why I'm so adamant on discussing things like anti-Blackness in our community, because it is through these lenses, even through shows that are now on Netflix, like Moesha, like The Parkers, like these things that like we kind of saw ourselves, right? And so understanding that they helped lead this movement so that we could also thrive, right? And so we have to do a lot of that internalized work from the lens that Latinidad often operates, which has been kind of by succumbing to whiteness, right? And a lot of people don't like the terminology white supremacy, but it does become that, right? I was watching a documentary on HBO the other day, and it's like one of those like Latinos in the US, you know, they have all those like different sort of things. And one of, I forgot her name, but it was an Afro-Latina actress, and she mentioned that there was a bigger Black population in Latin America than here in the US. And that blew my mind. And I was like, I didn't realize that. But even in this documentary, where you are saying that statistic, you are only one person of this whole documentary covering Latinos. So what are we doing to really uphold, you know, our Black Latino people? What are we doing to really like center them, right? And doing that and dismantling all these ideas of what the telenovelas have shown us, right? Because they're showing those same telenovelas in Latin America. So what is it telling our people there? That they have to be blonde and blue-eyed, right? And they have to fit this description or these stereotypes in order to find love or to succeed or do this and that. And it's like, no, we have to break those tropes. So in addition, I think it is funding a lot of the work of people like us, right? And really getting that power going that way, right? I've even joked about with someone like Maria, like how do we meet people where they are and make, you know, this, don't steal my idea, y'all, but like make zines or something on anti-Blackness in Spanish, right? So we can really discuss what this means. Can I take them to grocery stores? Because that's where I know my people are. I want to meet them where they are. I'm not trying to, you know, demean us, but I want us to be better. And so how do we do that? And it a lot of times comes from education. And I think education doesn't just have to stem from academia and the ivory tower in college. No, education can come from one another, right? And can come from street knowledge. And that's why I appreciate Clyde saying, you know, through the lens of hip hop, because same, right? Different generation. I wish I could rap myself, but I can't. But it's the same thing, right? This is why things like hip hop were created, because it was speaking this truth to power in a time when it was necessary. And so doing that and funding these spaces and funding these artists and these people that inspire you is critical to make this happen.
You know, to add to that, I think, go ahead, Clyde.
Well, I have to say that that elder's name, that brother's name, Felipe Luciano, who's a former young lord, Afro-Boricua, who was also a last poet. And if you know, think about urban culture and the role that the last poets played, and if you don't know the last poets, just Google them. You're going to get tons of YouTube videos. But they were important griots in the space in New York City in the 60s and 70s. You know, in the ilk of Gil Scott-Heron, right? And Felipe was primarily rolling with African Americans. You know, he had a fro, he was a brother, he was, you know, grew up in Harlem, so he could roll like that. And I remember asking him, what was the transition? How did you go from the Last Poets to the Young Lords? And he basically said that his brothers in that group were like, yo, you need to go over to the East Side and start working with your own people, right? To educate them. And he did that. And he had, you know, in no time, he had a leadership position within the Young Lords. And these are all folks that were maybe 20 years old, right? Like, you know, maybe 25. And they started doing that work in Spanish, right? So, you know, that is back to the organizing work at hand that transcends the, you know, election day that we all have to do in our own respective ways.
Absolutely. Thank you, Clyde. Florencia, did you want to add something? No? Okay. Sorry. I know we get excited and we want to chime in and we're unfortunately like sort of out of time. Someone did ask or mention, I'm interested in how we faith groups in our community can create understanding within our communities. I feel like these issues are solved in faith communities of color as well. They absolutely are. And I think there's a lot of truth that can come from those communities because we often see our faith communities as our savior, honestly. I know a lot of my family is very, very Catholic. And then for someone like me, I consider myself more spiritual, but even that was a process of getting my mom to understand, like, I still have my own journey, right? But I personally cannot ignore the historical factor of Catholicism, right? And understanding that Indigenous people were colonized and forced to also kind of subscribe to this nature. And I don't mean that, again, in a shady way. That's just confronting the truths of what history is and then has created within our culture, right? And why darkness is considered bad and lightness is considered good. And there's a lot of different norms that stem from that, but there's also a lot of beautiful power that can come if we really address and honor these true histories of our people. So I'm just going to mention that because I know we're out of time already, but there is a great conversation going and I'm getting a lot of feedback. So I wanted to make sure we touched on that. Another question we got is how can we do a better job to explain what a Latino is? Many people think Latino is a race. And so we actually did not cover this as I had hoped we would because the time flew by. But does anybody want to take this? This is a very fascinating concept because, like we said, these labels kind of keep getting applied to us. And so I know I grew up when people would ask what my race is, I would say Mexican. Right? And I know a lot of people were like me. And it wasn't until I went to college again, I didn't learn this knowledge until later on, where I was like, wait a second, Mexican's not a race, right? That's a nationality. But we don't have an in-depth understanding of what race is as Latinos in the United States because we see it as our specific, background. Did anybody else want to add anything? It does get super complex. We could probably have an entire other session on this topic alone.
I'm only going to say that when the census comes around, it's a tough box to check. And I consider myself a mixed race person.
Yeah, it gets super, super difficult, right? Even when I'm out, like, oh, okay, right? And then, but there's not an option for me to click like brown person, right? I cannot put that in the census. And my experience has not been that of a white person, but when I go to the hospital and I get, my papers, it says white. And so that, when I saw that, I was like, wait a second, this isn't adding up, right? And so understanding that there is a perception of how one's lived experiences and what this country considers Latinos as well, right? And then what we in our own identities can also demonstrate, right? We have a California Latino, a New York Latino, all these, within us four, we have completely different experiences. And so, yeah, I think it's first knowing that knowledge and understanding the difference of what ethnicity is, of what culture is, of what race is, of what all these things are, so you can explain that to people. I have seen a lot of videos that kind of explain it a little bit differently. But it is a hard thing to understand because this country never wanted to discuss race in the first place, right? Now it is, you cannot ignore it anymore. It is finally erupting, which I'm excited about because I love discussing race. But a lot of people don't want to. And again, that is intentional, right? There's a reason why, because we were supposed to subscribe to whiteness as norm. And so I think really understanding that and having understanding for whoever you're encountering, right? We cannot pretend we're all on the same page. We've been oppressed. We're all at different places, and we need to have both love and understanding when we're discussing these things with one another as well.
I think about the nuance that I grew up with in terms of colorism, right? That I think, Mexico in particular, with the Gastas paintings and the sort of like designation of like, if you quarter this and half that and blah, blah, blah. And in the United States, it was like one drop, right? You're either black or you're white. And so we rub up against that, but it's all and ultimately in juxtaposition to whiteness and white supremacy, right? And that's the part that we have to kind of remember, that there is no better form of oppression, in terms of whether or not we could, have 8 different names on the spectrum of color, in Spanish someplace, and somehow that's a better paradigm. The whole thing is it requires work to be deconstructed,
Absolutely. Colorism is a critical component for all of this, right? And our experiences and our truths as well. Florencia or Maria, did you want to add anything? If not, I'm going to ask everyone to share with me what you are up to, what your organization is up to, where we can follow and support your work as we get ready to close off our panel today.
I wish I had something to add, but I really don't, because like you, Clyde, I looked at the census with my eyes crossed because I had no idea what to fill it out. I know there was an other option and I opted for that one. And I know it's an ongoing conversation that, could go for hours if we really wanted to, but shout out to De Colores Radio, who has several podcasts that you could listen to in on these topics and more. In terms of what I'm up to, I was registering folks to vote and excited that we got those in by the deadline. Continuing to uplift the work done in several communities and finding more funding for DACA scholarships. For anybody who's watching, the North Texas Dream Team is providing DACA assistance throughout this COVID time. I've been mailing out DACA packets for folks, trying to meet our community in the middle where we can. And in terms of where you can follow me, I was like, I tend to post a lot of different things, but you can follow at Maria Yolis. You can also email me at Maria Y Garcia, like the letter Y, not Y, Maria Y Garcia 94@gmail.com. I wear many hats, but I'm really happy to support this growing landscape of Dallas and doing good and giving back.
Beautiful. Thank you, Maria.
Definitely second the shout out to De Colores. I'm looking forward to the reunion and y'all getting back into the mix. Let me know how I might be able to help. In terms of just what we're up to, look out for Black Power Naps and the VR Solitary Confinement exhibition, which will both be at Sweet Pass Sculpture Park this upcoming October. We're also working on a project internally here called the Black Album, which is on October 27th and October 29th, written and directed by Regina Taylor. That's coming out of SMU Meadows, also virtual. So we'll be sharing that out. And if you want to reach me and us, you could reach me at Instagram or Twitter at Clyde Valentin, just my full name, and Facebook, and igniteartsdallas.com.
I love it. I'm definitely excited for everything y'all have going on. The Black Album is Jay-Z in my mind, so I can't wait to see what comes next because that sounds amazing. Thank you, Clyde. Florencia.
I feel peer pressured into saying kudos to De Colores.
Stop it, you don't have to, I promise. I did not pay them to say that.
But, you know, this conversation about, or just the question about what to call ourselves, and, you know, Latino, Hispanic, it's not only is it controversial, but there's so many different perspectives on it. I am scheduled to do a cultural competency training for the during the Big Bang that's coming up in mid-October, and I am going to tackle it. So hopefully, I would love to see what this group is going to, how you feel about that. You know, the Concilio right now, in addition to our parent engagement classes, we're all and doing wraparound services for families. We're also we also developed a computer literacy curriculum to help bridge the tech divide for families. And so that's something that we offer to all families. If anybody's interested, to reach out to us. And then also we're involved with the census. So that question, Clyde, I mean, not only, you know, it was just, it's overwhelming. And I don't know that anybody really knows how to answer it correctly. And then as for where to find me, I am such a dinosaur. I have a Twitter account. I have I think I lost the code to it. I haven't tweeted in like 10 years. I have to do it.
We welcome dinosaurs on Twitter. It's okay.
Okay, well, I definitely need to, but and then follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at the Concilio. And so, you know, I promise you, I will try to do better on Twitter and engage. So
it's okay if you don't.
You are inspiring me to do it.
Beautiful. I feel so inspired by this conversation. I feel very grateful to have shared space with you all and honored to work with you all. Florencia, I can't wait till we work together because I know it's going to happen sometime soon. As much as I like to pretend, I cannot ignore De Colores shout outs from you all. I am very grateful for the space I've co-founded with two lovely other Dallas leaders here. And I am involved in a lot of different things. Just like Maria said, she wears multiple hats. I do too. That's probably why we're friends. So there's a few different ways that I would love to see y'all's involvement in a lot of the work I'm doing. So I do work with Big Thoughts. So I work with a lot of our wonderful youth here in Dallas and beyond, and I'm very grateful for that. So I recommend that. I do some work with Young Leader Strong City. Their program is coming up soon. So if you know any high school students that want to have discussions like this on race, I often hold some of their sessions. And so I'd be grateful to see you all there as well. De Colores Collective is my baby, my pride and joy that we've kind of had on hiatus since the pandemic began. But we are still active on social media and have been very involved with Our City, Our Future, which I helped co-found as well, that Clyde mentioned earlier. And that's a way to get involved more in demanding policy changes for our people beyond just the Latino community, but also gender nonconforming community, trans community, Black community, Indigenous community, and really being intentional with that as well. And then, of course, De Colores Radio is a podcast that we have built through De Colores Collective, where we have conversations like this weekly. And I have worked with a couple of you on different projects with that, but I'd love to see more of that, right? And more spaces like De Colores Collective, because we have been very intentional in building an anti-racist space for people to come together, for people by people, right? And so being very intentional in all of that. So you can support any of those places at their handles, and you can find me at Eva Arreguin. I am a mess and I like to have fun and be honest and speak my truth. So definitely don't be surprised, because I talk a lot about fat positivity and different things like that, uncomfortable conversations people don't like to have, right? Because I think it's critical with mental health, with our vulnerability, to really live and thrive and get through this hard time together. So I appreciate you all. Feel free to contact and support each one of these people, themselves individually and their organizations. They are doing a lot of incredible work continue to support Dallas TRHT. They are doing incredible work as well. And so I thank you all, honor you all, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Go continue to learn about our people, and let's keep moving forward.